couple of hours with us, sharing the content of the paper that he made available. The paper, you probably have already downloaded it, is freely downloadable from our website, of course. And so basically, I would hand over immediately to him, but not without pointing out one specific issue. And this, as you will see from the first slide that you show, considering that Finland, that is a country with, saying 4 million people, 20,000 lakes, and not much else, is able to export $6 billion of computing services. What should Italy do? Considering that we are just set in the middle of Mediterranean. Around we have a lot of developing markets that are eager to get technology, know-how, services, in order to speed up the development processes. What's the magic that you're missing? Why the hell are we exporting a fraction of our, knowing with all the respect for the Finnish people, I refuse to believe that they are substantially more brilliant than us. So what is the point?
They have more lakes.
They have more lakes.
We do not have 22,000 lakes.
Well, I don't know if there is a connection. So, of course, Sunil, in this room there are people that are very experienced. What's the magic? Why Finland is exporting 6 billion of computing services and we are exporting none? And what are the key success factors that we should invest on in order to get this bloody country to make our IT services industry a major factor of development for the economy? That's what keeps us awake at night and ensure that you, Sunil, can help us to address this major point. Ok, quindi benvenuti, grazie di essere con noi. Over to you.
Okay, first of all, I'm very delighted to be here, and I must thank Robert Nassiro for giving me the second chance to come here, because I was here last year and I really enjoyed it. And as he said, I'm actually teaching now at the Bocconi University. I'm teaching a course on foundations of innovation and industrial change to master's students, which I taught last year as well. And so I'm very delighted to be coming back to Milano for the second time. And this paper which I'm going to present is actually part of a large international project which is directed by Professor Franco Manerba of Bocconi and Professor Kun Lee of Seoul National University in Korea. And this project is actually looking at change in industrial leadership in a range of products and services across the world. Now, as I was telling some of your colleagues a little while ago, if you take any industrial product, for instance, you can start with cars. You can see that the United States used to be the leader, and then Germany and basically Western Europe became the leader in the second position, and then Japan became the leader, and now it's Korea. Okay, so you have a change in leadership which is happening. And if you take a very ordinary product like a camera, for a long time, initially Germany used to be the leader, and then Japan for a very long period of time was the leader, and now it's again Korea. Okay, and if you take the mobile phones, for instance, the United States used to be the leader. Motorola was one of the largest companies. Then Nokia became the leader. Your famous Finland became the leader for a very long period of time, almost accounting for 30% of the world market share, and quite recently they have been edged out again by Korea. Okay, and if you take most industrial products and indeed services, what you find is that a change in leadership is happening from the north to the south, and basically it is going to Asia, and one or two countries in Asia is actually becoming big. It's Korea and then China, and in one or two cases in India. Okay, so the story that I'm going to talk to you about is actually the story of services. All the other products that I mentioned are manufactured products. and where India has become the leader since 2005. Okay, and this leadership is actually measured in terms of your share in exports, and so I'm going to tell you about how India became the leader and how it's able to maintain that leadership position. Because as you can see, this leadership position cannot be maintained over a long period of time just because you are cheap in making things. Your cost of production is lower than some other country. Because that's what you have seen in the case of, you can achieve that kind of leadership for a short period of time, then other countries will catch up, you see. And so you have a change in leadership occurring and so on. And so this your attractiveness in terms of cost of production being lower than other countries should be matched with innovation so that you also become a much more efficient, technologically speaking. And that's a story that I'm going to present before you. And
But first of all, I have to ask you to move aside because
Yes.
otherwise it's not possible.
yes.
So you probably can poi toccare la sedia poi questo qua.
Oh, okay. Okay, so the way I'm going to talk to you is I will start with the change in leadership, which is actually happening in computer and information service. Software is referred to as computer and information service in the technical term. If you use the export data, you will not find an item called software, but you will find computer and information service according to the Standard International Trade classification of the data. Okay, so all the data are actually taken from the International Monetary Fund's balance of payments yearbook. So it's not based on national data or anything of that nature. So the data are comparable across countries because the same definition is actually used. So first I'm going to talk to you about how this leadership has changed from one country to another over a period of time. And then after that I will talk to you about the Irish story, because Ireland, which many people may not know, was actually the leader in software services until 2005. Okay, so the initial leader, it's not clear who was the initial leader, but the usual suspect is basically the United States, perhaps Germany and the UK. These were the initial leaders in software services. And when I'm talking about software, you have to bear in mind that I'm not talking about software products. Okay, software products are like like the Office suite of products or operating systems. I'm not talking about them. I'm talking about custom-made services which are actually done. So my study is only referring to that aspect and not about products. Okay, so the Irish story starts around the mid-1990s, and Ireland was able to continue that position until about 2005. But what we know about the Irish story is that there was very little local entrepreneurship in the Irish leadership, in the sense that Ireland became a very attractive position for multinational companies to go and set up their software development centers in Ireland. And so the Irish story was largely based on multinational development. And when the multinationals found that the cost of production in Ireland was actually becoming higher, they simply moved away to other countries, like for instance in India and so on. Okay. So one of the important points that I'm trying to make is that this leadership position, if you are trying to build, because if leadership is measured in terms of export shares, you can actually show a very high export share by simply inviting multinational companies, making your host economy very attractive for MNCs to come and operate. But that kind of leadership cannot be maintained for a long period of time, because MNCs are somewhat footloose. They can actually move from lock, stock and barrel. They can go from one country to another when things become not very attractive for them and so on. And then thereafter I will talk about, I'll give an overview of India's computer and information service sector, because there are some interesting things which are happening, because there are some very counterintuitive things which are happening there. Because one of the things that I want to say is that when you talk about computer information service, immediately things which comes to your mind is BPOs, okay, or customer interaction centers. In fact, what I'm trying to show you is that the share of customer interaction centers or BPOs in the share of exports that India is exporting is not very high. Okay, it's not very high. and much of it is IT services, and that is also there is evidence to show that that's going up the. There is evidence to show that there is going up the value chain as far as the information IT services are concerned. Then I will talk to you about 7 distinct features of this industry, and these features also will give you an idea as to why India became a leader in IT services. And after that, I will go on into some 6 factors which enable the country to become a leader and maintain that leadership position since 2005. And as you said, the leadership is not a permanent thing. Other countries can also catch up with you, and catching up is a constant thing in the development process. You find developing countries now catching up, like the story of Korea, and Korea was almost like 30 years ago was a developing country. Now it's a developed country, and China also is fast catching up with the rest of the world in terms of its technology and so on. So you need to have strategies for maintaining your leadership. Okay. So what are those strategies? And these strategies can be broadly divided into conventional strategies and new strategies. And the new strategies are extremely important because that's what gives the country ability to maintain this leadership position in the future. Then I'll conclude my presentation. Anytime you are very welcome to stop me and ask me for doubts and clarifications and so on. So let me start with the changing leadership. And this is the diagram, which the chart which Robert was actually trying to tell. This actually gives you the exports in billions of US dollars of the top 10 countries for IT services during 3 time points, 2000, 2005, and 2010. I didn't give you the time series data because that would be difficult to show in a graph, but it's there in the paper as well. If you are interested, you can look in the paper. Now you can see that in 2000, India exported only $4 billion worth of IT services. And in 2010, it is about 56.7 billion. So you can see the rates of growth are extremely high. Okay. In fact, what I'm arguing is that the rate, if you take along, the Indian IT services story starts around the late 1980s. From the late 1980s until now, the industry has been continuously growing at a rate of 20% and above. In fact, it was growing 30% and above for a long time, but quite recently, the rates of growth have actually started coming down. And I'll talk about that story as well. Now you can see that Ireland is the number 2 in the world in terms of export shares. In fact, it had almost like in 2007 billion, almost like double the Indian, almost like 100% more than what India was actually exporting. And what is interesting is that if you take the top 10 countries, what comes to your mind is that all of them are excepting for India and China, which is here. This is China. Okay. All the other countries are developed countries. Okay, in IT services. So there's not a single developing country which is in the top 10. Sometimes the story of Philippines and so on are given. Philippines is even in India, very often the discussion is that the Philippines is fast catching up with India. Okay, but actually Philippines exports is very little in terms of IT services. If you look at the IMF balance of payments yearbook, so a lot of the statements which are being made about exports and the growth of exports from various countries are purely based on impressions, are not based on actual data. Okay, so it's like the story of the emperor, the emperor without the clothes, and so a lot of those countries are actually emperors without the cloth, and you put them on a very exalted position, but actually when you look at the numbers of what they are exporting, it's not much. Okay, so these are the 10 leading countries. And what is most interesting is the Chinese story. China hardly exported $0.35 billion in 2000. And by 2010, with a matter of 10 years, they have come to about $9 billion. Now, you know that China has one aspect which pulls it down in terms of exports of software services, which is its English language capability. Because English language capability is one of the important factors which is required for, but not the most important. Because if English language capability is indeed the most important reason as to why India and China, India is catching up, then what about East Africa or West Africa? The Nigerians and the Kenyans speak much better English than Indians. They can, or an average Nigerian or an average, Kenyan or a Ugandan can speak much better English than Indians. So it's not the English language capability which enables a country to, that's one of the factors, but that's not the most important factor. Okay, but you can see that China is overcoming that language barrier and other thing, and it's coming up. And one interesting thing is that many Indian companies have actually gone up and set up shops in China, and they are developing software from China and exporting. So some bit of these exports are also contributed by Indian companies which have actually gone to China. But so you can see this kind of a change in leadership, which is largely the preserve of developed countries. Essentially because when you talk about software services, the customer is important. And the customers are all in the developed world. Okay, they are not in the developing world. Because some software services are used where computers are used. And the diffusion of computers in various activities in the northern countries are much more than in the southern countries. So the market for services are still in the north and not in the south. Okay, although the south can catch up in terms of markets. So that's why the share in exports it's always going to be an exports. Exports are going to be much more important than the domestic market. And the exports are largely to the United States and Western Europe. Okay, so you can see this change in leadership which is happening, and this has happened essentially in the mid 2000s. Okay, so that's the first point that I'm trying to make.
Any question?
Yeah.
There is specialization with focus
Exactly.
on specific sector, the various country, or the same?
Well,
Finland is mostly telecom, and China is mostly something else, or
yes,
they work in the same sector?
we don't have those domain specific data. What they are actually focusing on. But what you like, for instance, India is not specializing in any specific sector. Okay, it's on a wide range of sectors like retail, trade, telecom, and any kind of sector. Wherever computers are used, you require software, specific software which are custom made, and that's done. So you don't have that information about specificity. You don't have that.
Question.
Yeah.
Can you comment about the specific industrial policies that some of these countries have been using in order to achieve this level of development of this industry?
Yeah, I'll come to that when I talk about the factors. Yes. Yeah.
Excuse me, do you have an idea which is the dimension of service and software?
Yes.
Because software and service is quite different in terms of export.
Percentage of software and services.
Oh, we don't have that data on software products, and because the international trade data.
No, it's just
Yes.
an indication because talking to Phil, and
Yes.
I can imagine that if it includes software, and if it includes also the software of a smart device,
Oh, yes.
Nokia is very important.
Yes, you are talking about embedded software. Yes, that should be included here. Okay. So now you can see this change in leadership occurring, and this is the ratio of India's exports to Ireland. Okay, so when the ratio is greater than 1, that means India is exporting more than Ireland. The change happened. So you have the line of unity, which is there in the red line, and the change is happening exactly at 2005. So and then you can see that India is increasing its distance with Ireland, became a leader, and it's increasing. And this is the story that I'm trying to tell, that it is not only achieving the leadership, but also going up the value chain in terms of improving your sophistication in terms of the services that you're offering, so that you can become and maintain your leadership. So that's what I'm sure. Now, how did Ireland become a leader? Because this is not there in the literature, because literature doesn't really, the literature on software services doesn't pick up this important fact that Ireland was actually a leader. Okay? How did Ireland become a leader in terms of a software leader in Europe? Now, there are three domestic factors we can talk about, and this is the answer to what you have been asking. First one is that Ireland, first of all, dramatically reduced its corporate income tax rate. Okay, while on an average in Europe it's 30% plus, Ireland had 12% and so on. Okay, so it became a kind of tax haven. So that's the first thing that they did, so that you can attract multinational companies to come and set up shops there, especially the American multinational companies. Okay, so that's the first one, which is first policy. The second one is massive public investments in telecom infrastructure, which enabled Ireland to have a very modern telecom infrastructure in the Western European. So you have very low tax rates and very good physical infrastructure, which is very much required for software services, because you don't require, roads and other kind of physical infrastructure. What you require is very good telecom infrastructure. Okay, because a lot of the transactions that you do and the interactions that you do is online. So once you have that kind of a telecom infrastructure, so that's what Ireland had. The next one is that Ireland also had a very good human capital, especially computer scientists. And also they were very young, and in fact 47% of the population during that period was less than 29 years. And of course the massive investment in higher education, and the Irish universities were considered to be quite good in the Western Europe, especially in science and engineering education. So you have very low tax rates, very good physical infrastructure, especially telecom, and very good human infrastructure which can speak English as well. And so that was a very important factor. Okay. And in fact, you can see that almost like 25% of the student enrollments are actually in technology-related settings. It's one of the highest in Western Europe. So, so if 100 students entering, 25%. This is the kind of figure that you can see that in Korea or China, where you have a very large, a quarter of the students are actually entering into engineering and science-related disciplines, which is very much required. So the good quality human resource, good physical infrastructure, low tax rates, so naturally multinationals are attractive. So you have a lot of multinational companies coming and setting up development centers in Ireland, taking advantage of all these services. Plus, it's also close to the main market in Western Europe. Okay, so instead of exporting directly from the US, you set up the design centers in Ireland and then service the huge market in Western Europe. So it becomes much more interesting. The second factor was also the availability of Irish who have come from the United States, the diaspora, which is also very important. And later on, when I talk about the Indian story, this also becomes very important. There is a common thread between India and Ireland, that the Indian diaspora, for instance, in the Silicon Valley, has been very important as a source of information on markets, technology, and sometimes even venture capital for Indians back home. So likewise, the Irish also have exactly the same thing. They could take advantage of the huge diaspora which was in the United States. So all these factors actually made Ireland. But the most important thing is that almost like 90% of the exports of software services from Ireland was by affiliates of multinational companies operating from Ireland. So there was very little local entrepreneurship. Okay, so you can hardly name an Irish software company. Now, Accenture is referred to as an Irish software company. Okay, Accenture, which is a very large company, is referred to as an Irish software. Its headquarters is in Dublin, if I'm not mistaken. But you know that it is a company which was set up by Irish diaspora from the United States. So it's basically American Irish people who have actually been behind. So otherwise you don't have very many local Irish companies which is exporting. Okay, there are some small companies that are. So this is the main weakness that you would find, is that when you have your multinational led development, the multinational, and when other countries also lower the tax rates, okay, when other countries improve the telecom infrastructure, and when other countries also increase the quality of their human resource and also much cheaper, there's no reason why, and distances don't matter as far as software is concerned, because these things are, as I said, online activities. So if you have a good telecom infrastructure, distances don't. So there is a kind of a depth of distance as far as telecom software services are concerned. So companies started running away from Ireland and going to other countries. Okay, so now, so that's the end of the Irish dream. And in fact, if you were to read a recent article which has come in the Economist magazine, that raises a number of points against the Irish development, because you have a number of companies setting up offices in Ireland essentially to take advantage of this tax haven status. Okay, so sometimes some of these exports are not even done in Ireland. They're booked through the office in Ireland. So they are not actually developed in, because if you look at the number of software engineers in Ireland and the amount of software that is exported, there is, unless these engineers are extremely productive, you cannot actually square up the two, the number and the quantity. Okay, unless these are almost like superhumans, you cannot. So the Irish story has that kind of a thing. So now I come to the Indian story, and this shows the first one actually shows the rate of growth of the exports. And what you can see is that the growth rate of exports, and this has been calculated only from 2001 onwards. This is the annual percentage change. The Indian growth story, starts sputtering from around the mid-2000s, much before the financial crisis. Okay, the Indian government and the policy makers would like to attribute the fall in the growth rate to financial crisis, but it's nothing to do with the financial crisis. It's happened. Financial crisis is this one. Okay, but this reduction started continuously, and you can see that it has actually come down quite drastically, and now again picking up. Okay. But what is interesting is that so the rate of growth has come down. But that doesn't mean that absolute values of exports have come down. But the rate of growth of exports have actually come down, essentially because of the problems. Because almost like 80% of the software services are exported, and the export markets are basically in the United States and Western Europe, and a little bit in Japan. Now, because the US market was in recession for a long time, and so your ability to export is actually now going down. Okay, and that's number one. The second factor is that because of protectionist policies, which are also followed by the US, for instance, you can see the Obama statements quite recently, and within the states within the United States, some of them don't like to have their work sent abroad because they feel that it has a deleterious effect on employment within the United States. Because if work is going to India, then many people who are employed in those services in the United States lose their employment. And so many of the states within the United States are now putting some kind of penalties on companies which are actually sending work to India. For instance, they cannot become eligible for receiving public contracts. Public contracts will not be given to companies which actually go to India. So Indian companies have to do the thing of going and setting up shops in the United States and then servicing the requirement from there. So those won't be booked as Indian exports because these are not exports. These are happening within the United States and servicing the clients in the United States. So that's one of the reasons as to why this rate of growth is coming down. That doesn't mean that the capability is getting lost. Okay, but yeah,
and probably also in Europe we establish
yes.
the same relaxation.
Yes, exactly, same. But the government of India, for instance, is now actively encouraging the companies to diversify their markets and also to use the domestic market, because the domestic market in India is potentially very huge, because very little computers are used right now. But the more computers, because the installation base of computers is largely in educational institutions and in the government. And so if the government starts more e-governance activities, that can itself increase the demand for software within India. Okay? And another area is if the retail market in India is opened up. Okay? And you have modern supermarkets and that hypermarkets and so on coming up. That can also increase the demand for software within the, especially for logistics and so on, within the country. So the government is actually trying to increase the size of the domestic market as a way of taking care of this problem of lowering growth rates. And this line actually shows the share of software, the value added of the software service sector in India's GDP. Okay, and that's actually, so it is the value added. It's not the exports divided by GDP. You cannot do that because exports is a sales, and value added, as you know, is output minus the material inputs which are used. And GDP is nothing but the gross value added of the country. So if you take the value added, what you can see is that the software sector right now is contributing like 3% of India's GDP. Now this is extremely significant because the number of persons, as I will talk about that a little later, employed in the software industry in India is very small. Okay, so we're not talking in terms of millions of people. We are talking in terms of hundreds thousands of people. Okay, at best, the software industry claims that the industry employs something like 3 million people, but that seems to be a little bit of exaggeration because they count all kinds of people as employed. So less than 3 million people, I'll talk about the correct figure a little later. Less than 3 million people are contributing 3% of the GDP of the country. So that means these people are highly productive. Okay, and that productivity is also a very important story that I will talk about.
What's the total population of India?
It's about 1 billion.
Okay.
1 billion. Okay, so less than 3 million. Yeah, less than 3 million is contributing 3%. So it's quite an important sector for India. Now, if you take exports of India, now you have the blue line shows the blue bars actually shows the share of software exports in total service exports from India. Okay, so that is something almost like averaging around about 45%. So 45% of the service exports are software services. If you take the total exports of India, almost like 15% is software services. Okay, total exports is services plus commodities. Okay, so that's total exports. And so for India, this is a very important item, and this can be seen from this figure itself. This is India's current account deficit. Like somebody was asking me what is exports, difference between exports and imports. And you can see that India's current account deficit has been in the red for the last years. For instance, for the most recent period, the current account deficit is something like $14 billion. That we are importing more than our exports, both goods and services, and this is quite a nasty thing. Okay, but I'm sorry, I made a mistake. The current account deficit is now about $7 billion. Now, assuming we didn't have any software exports, okay, software exports were zero, the current account deficit would have been 14 billion. So it is the software exports which is actually enabling India to reduce its current account deficit. Another item which is helping India is actually remittances by Indian working abroad. Okay, India is also the largest remittance receiving country in the world. It gets close to something like $70 billion every year, based on money which Indians who are working abroad, especially in the Middle East, and sending back home. Okay, Middle East and also in the United States. And a lot of the people who are working in the United States are actually software personnel. Okay, so they save a bit of money from their because many of them have actually gone under the H-1B visas, which, as you know, are specialty visas which are issued for a period of 6 years. So they cannot remain permanently in the United States, although some of them try to adjust to permanent status, but they have to go back after a period of 6 years. So which means that they have their dependents back in India, and they sent money back to maintain their families in India, and those amounts also are very large. Okay, so the software service sector that way has become a very important sector for even keeping the external sector balance of the country for a long period of time. Now, what is the software export sector? So this is basically the structure of the software export sector in the country, based on a survey done by the Reserve Bank of India, which is the central bank of the country. Okay, and so, for instance, in 2007-8, when the first survey was done, about 2/3 of the software services which are exported are IT services, and BPOs is only about 20%. Okay, and very often people say that, oh, what is being exported is basically call centers, but that's only 20%, and you can see that that share has only increased to 21% in between these 5-year period. Okay, so it's not increased that much. Now, software product development is also increased. The government is encouraging companies to develop software products, because in software products, your ability to go up the technology sophistication is more in software products and services. So, but that's not increasing that much. It's remaining. In fact, it is slightly come down if you look between the two periods. And then you have this engineering services which are being exported, and that's slowly increasing. And in fact, this is one sector which the government is actively trying to promote: engineering and R&D services. That Indian companies does R&D, research and development services for multinational companies, and that's being done. So largely, the software which is exported is IT services, which spans a number of domains, not any one specific domain. So that's the story. How are these things being exported? Now, according to the World Trade Organization, there are 4 modes through which you can export a service. Okay, Mode 1, which is cross-border supply. Indian company exports a service to an Italian company. Okay, so that is that's a cross-border supply. That is the normal exports. Okay, so you can see that most of the, almost like 2/3, little over 2/3 of the exports are cross-border supply. Mode 2 is consumption abroad. An Italian company or a person from Italy goes to India and buys some software services in India and takes it back to Italy. Okay, but that is very little, because software services is not something you can find that in tourism. Okay, and Italian tourist goes to India, consumes the tourist service there, and then comes back to Italy. So that would be the consumption abroad. Okay, but that's very little. Mode 3 is commercial presence. That is, Indian company sets up an affiliate in Italy, and that affiliate services the market here. Okay, so that is mode 3. But that again, you can see it's not very high. It's remaining same because of the various difficulties of setting up and so on. And a lot of these mode 3 is not because Indian companies have actually come and set up their branches here, but they have taken over small companies here in Italy or in Western Europe or Germany or in the United States and service the clients there. Okay, so that's commercial presence. And mode 4, which is which used to be very important. This is movement of natural persons. An Indian goes to the United States, an Indian software engineer goes to the United States and renders some services to a US company and goes back. Okay. Now this mode 4 used to be very important in the earlier period for the simple reason that an American company is not willing to send its work to India because they don't know about the capability and the quality of the Indian company. Rather, they would like to have the engineers come to the United States and on site they should execute the projects. Okay, and so that used to be the mode earlier, and you can see that it's steadily coming down. And it's also steadily coming down because of the visa problems, visa restrictions, and so on. And in fact, you would have read in the newspapers about Indian software engineers sometimes getting even arrested for having the wrong visa, coming in the wrong visa, and so on. So mode 4 is something which is not growing at all. And in fact, India has been trying to work with the Western governments essentially to make the movement of natural persons easy. But this also can be a problem. I'll talk about it a little later, because the higher the mode 4, higher will also be the likelihood of brain drain from India. Because an engineer goes abroad to do a work for a multinational company in the United States, and after the completion of that project, he doesn't go back to India, but he tries to get a different job in the United States and try to remain there. Okay, but you can see that mode 1 is the most important, which is cross-border supply, which means work is actually done in India and then executed and exported to the United States. And you can see that the offshore is work which is done in India is increasing. It's almost like 80%, and the on-site is coming down, which is quite similar to the figures that I showed you earlier. The mode 1 can be roughly equal to offshore, and on-site would be all the rest. Okay, so that's kind of, so much of the work is actually software services are actually developed in India and then exported to the United States and so on. Okay. Now, what is the software industry? How many firms are? The questions were being asked. Who are these software firms? Are these multinationals like the Ireland, or are they local companies? Now, strange though it may sound, Government of India does not have a clear idea as to how many software companies are there in India. Okay. And according to the registration data with the Ministry of Corporate Affairs, we have something like 52,000 companies which are registered as small software companies. So there are about 52,000 companies in India which are developing software companies. And most of these companies are in a few regions. So they're not spread out the whole country, but they're concentrated in few regions. In fact, I'll come back to this point because this clustering is also very important, because clustering of firms producing similar technology items can sometimes be a necessary condition for innovations to occur. Okay, and you have a number of interesting clusters in Italy itself, and how those clusters, and most of these clusters are organic clusters. They are not being created by the government, but they have sprung up on their own. And these organic clusters or historically evolved clusters are likely to be very innovative. According to the NASSCOM is basically the industry association, the National Alliance for Software and Service Companies. Okay, the NASSCOM, which was set up in 1988. There are only about 1,400 firms. Okay, so according to the government, there are 52,000 firms, but according to NASSCOM, there are only about 1,400 software firms. But 90% of the exports are actually contributed by a few large companies. So, and the few large companies are not more than 20. Okay. In fact, on the top, you have 3 companies which are very large. Tata Consultancy Services, TCS, is the largest Indian company, followed by Infosys, and third is Wipro. So these are the three largest companies in India, and all these three companies have now become very multinational. They are all over the world. They have offices all over the world, and they have production centers also all over the world. And they are taking over companies in all over the world and so on. But at the same time, India has a general policy of being very welcoming to multinational companies since 1991. Since 1991, India is becoming much more liberalized, allowing the private sector to have much more freer access to everything. And as part of that policy, they have also been very welcoming to multinational companies. In fact, what you find is that even states within India are competing with each other to attract MNCs to their respective areas. Okay, so you have a competition in terms of giving tax benefits and so on. So a kind of Irish story is slowly starting to evolve. Okay, where India is also becoming very welcoming to multinational companies, but not in software, but in generally speaking. But then, you know, when you have a very favorable climate for foreign direct investments, multinational software multinational companies like Hewlett Packard, for instance, HP, for instance, can also come to IBM and so on, but also coming to India. In fact, what you can see is that the latest NASSCOM data, and most of these multinational companies don't report their India-centric data. Okay, so that's why I cannot answer very clearly what is the share of these multinational. Like earlier, I showed you the Ireland where 90% of the exports were by multinationals. But in India, we cannot have that data because the multinational companies are not reporting their India-centric, exports. But wherever they are reporting, some of them do report. Some of the companies do report. So if you take the top 20 companies, you can see that the three largest of them are already multinationals. Okay, Accenture is one, Cognizant is another one, Honeywell is another one. These three have become very. But of course, my own suspicion is that IBM would be the largest. Okay, and this suspicion will become very clear later on when I discuss the patenting, the number of patents, because these companies are also doing a lot of research in India and taking out patents. Okay, and so in the patents data, these multinationals come up very, very sharply. So I pick up this point. So the structure is largely in terms of large number of small companies and a few large Indian companies and some multinational companies. And the share of multinational companies looks like it is actually on the increase. So you can see that if you take a distribution almost like 1 billion, and above exports, 95% of the exports are actually contributed by very large companies. So you have a very large number of very extremely small companies coexisting with. So it's a positively skewed distribution that you would find in India. Now let me go into the. Thank you. Now let me go into the distinctive features of this industry. The first one is the industry is very highly export oriented. Okay, almost like 78% of the exports, the sales are actually exports. Now, why am I raising this point? Because the fact that you are exporting, your market is abroad, you have to be good. Because if you are bad, then you can't export because there are other countries competing with each other, with you, so you have to be good if you want to really sort of exports to do the exports. And you can see that the growth of export markets, which I showed you earlier also, that is this one, has been going down, but of late has been slowly going up. And you can see that the domestic market is also now started picking up because of the various points that I made earlier. That is, the government is now trying to shift the market in favor of domestic market, so that these changes in the external markets, like the recession and so on, are not affected. Okay, the industry is not affected by that. So that's the first thing. The second point is that the industry had very high growth of exports for a very long period of time. Okay, so I think. Sorry. No. Okay, very high. This I already showed you. Very high growth rate. Now, if I take these growth rates backwards to about 1988, they have been growing at about 30%. Now, you don't have an industry which is growing at 30% for well over 20 years. And so you have this very high growth rate of exports, which I said has now started coming down since the mid-2000 onwards. And another interesting thing is that now you can actually export, but you can also, the industry can also import. Okay. Now India has a number of export items, like for instance, India is one of the largest exporter of jewelry. Okay, the ornaments, jewelry, and semi-precious stones. But those exports also incur a lot of imports because you import the precious stones, you polish them, make them into jewelry, and then you send them, export them abroad. So the net exports is not very high. Okay, whereas in the case of software, the net exports is very high. It's almost like 97%. Okay, so the imports are very low. Of course, that should be the case because when much of it is on offshore, that is work which is being done in India. So there's nothing like the imports which is happening, and you can see that the imports is actually the net exports is improving over a period of time, and this is directly related to the ratio of on-site to offshore. Okay, when on-site to offshore increases, offshore to on-site increases, the gross to net also increases. There is a direct relationship between the two. And this actually puts Indian companies into close interaction with very discerning, high-quality customers abroad. So one way in which you can improve yourself is to put you into the company of good quality customers who will demand high quality work from you. Okay, so most of the Indian companies are actually dealing with Fortune 500 companies, the top Fortune 500 companies. So modern ways of doing business and all those cultural things which used to pull India backwards. Being very lethargic, not being very strict about being punctual and not strict about quality. All these sort of things are now taken care of because you are dealing with customers who won't tolerate that kind of behavior. Okay, so that has actually pulled up the people by their socks, as if it were. So that's been a very important source. In fact, by having conversations with good customers abroad, you are in a position to get some new ideas, and then you work on those new ideas, and then you go up the value chain. So that has also been a very interesting aspect. Next is organized as clusters. Okay, this is very, very important because the industry is not spread out. It's not geographic. So geographical proximity is very important in terms of learning and capability building because it is possible. First of all, you can have agglomeration economies. You have companies doing exactly the same thing, or in a small unit area, so you can learn from each other. Okay, you can talk to each other, and there is also a movement of people from one company to another, and so every company sort of benefit. Now, if you look at seems to have so this is that. So you have these 5 clusters in India, and Bangalore continues to be this is Bangalore, Bangalore in the south of India is the major cluster, almost like 30% of the software is produced in Bangalore alone. Okay, of course the share of Bangalore is slowly coming down because the other clusters are catching up. The next important cluster is the Mumbai-Pune area. Okay, in fact Pune is a place which is very close to Mumbai. It is now becoming a major high-tech city. Almost all major, and it's also the major center for the India's automotive sector. All major automotive companies are located there in Mumbai. Fiat, for instance, is also operating from that area, you know, and Mercedes-Benz, all these sort of companies are also operating in that area. And this is the Gurgaon, Noida, Delhi area, which is near the national capital region, and because of the proximity to Delhi. And you have Chennai and Hyderabad, which are also becoming very important. Chennai, Hyderabad, and Bangalore, these are in the south of the country. Okay, they are in the south of the country. So you have much of the software production happening in clusters, and that's very important because companies can learn from each other. They can become much more innovative because the literature on clusters especially tells you that those clusters which have evolved historically or without the arm of the government, they are likely to be very innovative. And if you try to create a cluster through public policy action, they are less likely to be innovative because the members of the cluster would have actually taken position inside the cluster to take advantage of various incentives. Okay, and so that's another sort of finding that you find here. The next is a small number of highly skilled personnel. I told you that the software industry employs less than 3 million. Okay, according to the numbers that I have, it is not more than 250,000. Okay, 250,000 people are actually 250,000 people, which means about 0.25 million. Okay, it's less than a million people are actually employed in the software industry, according to official data by the National Sample Survey Organization. Okay, but the software industry, as the NASSCOM, claims that there are 3 million people, and many governmental reports also puts the number to be around 3 million because they count all those temporary people, you know, people who are temporarily employed also as part of the thing. But what you can see is that the gross value added per worker, that is the amount of value added per worker in the software industry, that has been growing phenomenally over, and this is in millions of rupees. And so it was less than a million in 2001, and right now it is close to about 3 million. One worker is having a value added of 3 million. So you can see that the growth rate of this productivity curve. Value added per worker is a measure of labor productivity. So labor productivity is actually very high. Okay, and in fact, I can later on during the discussions also show you that if you put $1 of, let's say, R&D investment in India, and if you put the same dollar of R&D investment in China,
What's the situation between the rupees and the dollar today?
it's about 60 rupees.
$1 is 60.
Yeah, $1 is 60 rupees. Okay, if you put $1 of R&D investment in India, and if you put the same $1 of R&D investment in China, the Indian dollar earns you more patents than the Chinese. Okay, so if you look at the import of R&D services by the United States from India, which is about, according to the National Science Foundation of the US, and available in the Science and Engineering Indicators, is something like 1.4 billion US dollars is the import of R&D services by American companies from India. And similar figure from China is only about 800 million. Okay, so less than 1 billion. So India is almost like 100% more than China as far as. So what I'm trying to tell you is the productivity of a worker in India is actually quite high. Okay, and that has also been a very, so by having a small number of people, but the industry has been able to grow essentially because of this very high levels of productivity. Okay. The next one is that almost all the firms which are set up in India are new. They are not old firms, excepting the Tatas. The Tata is basically an old company, and all other companies have a history of less than 20 years. Infosys didn't exist a long time ago. Okay, maybe 20, 25 years is their actually age of those companies. Now this is significant because that means they don't have a big baggage to carry. Okay, baggage in terms of bad practices and bad ways of doing business, which used to be the hallmark of I shouldn't say hallmark, which used to be the characteristic of Indian companies. Okay, and always trying to take advantage of loopholes in governmental regulations and so on. And so that is not there at all in these companies because the work culture in these companies itself is absolutely Western-like. Okay?
Question, but who are the investors?
The investors are basically, I come to that. The investors are basically technology-based entrepreneurs. Okay, so if
are
you
they Indians or
Indians, basically Indian. Say for instance, if you take Infosys, which is the second largest company, was actually set up by 3 engineers getting together. These are and these engineers have gone to the best Indian engineering school, which is the Indian Institute of Technology. Okay, so they came out after a 4-year BTech program, and they have bright ideas in their mind, and they could see that software is going to be a future growth area. So they set up a company essentially to service that, and so their entire attitude and behavior is very different because most of you can trace the starting of these companies by well-trained Indian engineering graduates. Okay, and many of them have Western education as well. Some of them have gone abroad to the United States and have done a master's program, sometimes even a PhD, and have come back. So they have that Western kind of outlook, and so all these companies are Western-like companies. Okay, so if you were to sort of walk into the I don't know whether you have been to any of the Indian software companies. If you were to walk into the campus of Infosys in Bangalore, you will not realize that you are actually in India. It looks very much like a Western campus. Yes, extremely well laid out, and and it's a beautiful campus, and the work culture and everything is Western-like. It's not like a typical Indian. So outside may be very bad, but inside it is it's like a oasis. Okay, and this is not just in symbolic way, but also in terms of the work culture which you find in this organization. So I think that has also been a very important thing. The next one is an important point, which is what you have is a co-evolving sectoral system of innovation. What you find is that if you take any country which has actually grown and caught up with the Western countries, like take for instance Japan to begin with. Okay, now Japan did not grow and catch up with the West by developing all its industries. It developed certain sectors like electronics and automotive. Okay, and within these sectors, it had put in place various kinds of institutions and support systems which would allow technical change to happen in that industry, in that sector. Now later on when you look at Korea, that's precisely what you see again. Korea did not develop all its industries, but basically the semiconductor industry, which it became a kind of a leader in that later on, and that enabled it to become a leader in electronics and so on. Okay? And so you can see that the sectoral systems of innovation, that is institutions and incentive systems which are required for supporting technical change within a particular sector, that has to evolve also with the growth of the industry. So it is not as if the government has put everything day one and then the private firms have taken advantage of that. No. The government started putting systems in place once the private sector firms have started showing some success. Okay, so if you have been to India, one thing which you are struck with is a very bad physical infrastructure, bad roads, poor electricity, and so on. So what the government has done is actually setting up various kinds of parks where under controlled conditions you have very good infrastructure, very good electricity doesn't fail. In a typical Indian place when I'm giving a talk, some 200 times the electricity will fail. And you need to have various kinds of technology to take care of that, like uninterrupted power supply systems, UPS. Okay, And so when you buy a computer, you have to buy a UPS, you have to buy a stabilizer because electricity fluctuates. Although electricity is 220 to 240, just like you are here, but it fluctuates from 110 to 300. So you need other equipments to take care of all these things. But in these parts, what you find is that everything is provided in a controlled conditions. So what I'm trying to tell you is that the government policy, it is not the government policy which drove the companies to become successful. The companies showed success through their own dint of hard work and knowledge. Then the government stepped in to support them. Okay, and so that's what. So it is not government and then the private sector, but it is private sector first and then the government. Now it is both government and private sector. Okay? So that's what you find as far as the sectoral system is concerned. Now I go into the, so I've given you the 7 factors which are actually the distinctive factors. I go into what are the factors which have enabled India to become a world leader. Okay? And I have 6 factors here. First, of course, the most important thing is like the story that I told you about the Infosys. Okay? How did any of those companies come in? Basically, extremely well-trained engineers who decided not to go to the United States because most of them, from most of these Indian institutes of technologies, the moment you finish a 4-year BTech program, now let me tell you, to get into those Indian institutes of technology is extremely difficult because you have, for a few seats, millions of students competing after school. Millions of students. In fact, they start preparing from the class 8 onwards. They don't, many of them actually sleep very little. They work extremely hard, and parents also push them, to get into this business, into this engineering schools because they are considered to be very prestigious. And there are about 5 of them. Now the government has started more of them all over the country. And the moment you finish a 4-year BTech program, Bachelor of Technology program, let's say in computer science or whatever it is, many of them actually go abroad to the United States, to Stanford, to MIT and other places to do a MS and a PhD program. Nothing much is heard about them afterwards. Okay, they remain back in the in those countries. But in the case of software, the tipping point was that some of them decided not to go. They remained back and set up these companies, and these companies they attracted other people to come by giving them share options. Okay, they gave them shares in the company. So all the people who joined the companies also became kind of owners of the company, and you can see the capital gain, has gone to something like, in some cases, 3,000, 4,000%. Okay, so some of them have become billionaires in this process of 20 years of high growth rates. So that I think is one of the first important, good quality English-speaking engineers has been one of the reasons as to why India has been. The second one, of course, is the role of the state itself. Now, this cannot be dismissed at all because you cannot say that the Indian software story is a private sector-driven story. The role of the state was actually also quite important. For instance, the state in initial period also demanded some software services, like for instance the Indian Railways. The Indian Railways is one of the largest rail network in the world. Okay, and in fact it's almost like a separate government in India. They have their own budget and so on. So it's functioning like they have their own separate telecom network and so on. Now the Indian Railways had huge market for software because all the, if you want to book a ticket, okay, now you can buy a ticket in India from any small station to any small station from anywhere in India. Okay, so that is a huge order. So such orders were also given. But when you talk about the role of the state, the following things come. Basically, 4 things come. First one is improvement of physical infrastructure. As I told you, India is notorious for bad infrastructure, bad roads, electricity, and so on. But the most important thing is the telecom infrastructure. Okay, the telecom infrastructure in India has improved so well over the last 20 years, essentially because the government privatized the telecom services. The whole country was divided into 23 markets, okay? And in each of the markets, the government allowed something like 4 service providers, okay? So you have heavy competition between these service providers. And each of those markets are something like 30 to 40 million subscribers, they have. So they are almost equivalent to some countries. Okay, each of those markets are almost like sometimes 2 countries. Okay, and or 3 countries like Finland is only about 5 million, so India has now the cheapest telecom services anywhere in the world. So from being one of the worst countries in terms of telecom, in a matter of 20 years, it is now the best telecom infrastructure. You can get a phone quickly, and it is the cheapest. So you can make calls from India to abroad, for a few cents, and almost. And the total number of telephones in the country is now, as I was telling some of our colleagues, something like 900 million phones. Okay, and the density of so improvement in telecom infrastructure has been a tremendously important thing for the software industry because they have access to very good quality, cheap telecom services, which enables them to do this offshore services very quickly. Okay, so that's one interesting thing. Second point is that they also tried to develop the domestic market. As I was trying to tell you that, if you look at the software is used where computers are used, and most of the computers are in government or in education institutions, which are also like universities and so on, which are also owned by the state. Most of the universities in India are owned by the state. We have few private universities which have come up, but most of them are public. Okay, and so the government itself is a huge consumer of software, and the moment the government's consumption of software increases in form of e-governance, for instance, that can drive up the domestic market. Okay, so that is now happening. For instance, I am now able to make all my payments online. Okay, including my income tax and everything, I can do that online. Okay, and I can get various kinds of certificates, birth certificates, and so on, online. And I can book tickets, by buses and trains online. So this is, and most Indian educational institutions are automating with enterprise resource planning, ERP systems being implemented. So that, I think, is going to be a major thing where the domestic market will improve. And so exports, even if something happens to exports, but you still have a domestic, and I already showed you the growth rate of domestic market, which is slowly going up. But another interesting thing is, just like Ireland, India also was a tax haven, which many people don't realize. Okay, for instance, the effective tax rate for you have the effective tax rate here, which is given in the blue bars, and the subsidy rate, which is the corporate income tax rate minus the effective tax rate. That's the subsidy rate, is given in the red bars. And what you can see is that for IT services, the effective tax rate was only 6%. When Ireland was giving 12%, India was actually giving only 6% effective corporate income tax rate for software companies. But what you can see is that the government used that as an infant industry protection argument. When the infant is, when the baby is small, you give various kinds of tax concessions. But when the baby stands up and is growing up, you withdraw the taxes. And that's precisely what you see. You can see that the effective tax rate is now going up. It's reached 22.94%, where the statutory corporate income tax rate in India is 33%. So still they get a subsidy, but the subsidy has been brought down. Okay, and this is a similar figure for BPOs. Okay, so BPOs also get a tax concession, but that's been brought down. Okay, so you can see that the subsidy is being withdrawn when the baby is growing up. Okay, so that's a correct strategy. Of course, the baby doesn't like it. They sometimes ask for more concessions. Even if they are doing well, they still ask for more money and so on. So then the overall policy, the government has come out with a information technology policy quite recently in 2012, and they have put a very important target. Okay, the target is domestic plus exports is now $100 billion right now. Domestic exports alone is about 70 billion right now. Domestic is about 30 billion. They want that to grow to 300 billion by year 2020. Okay, so there is a kind of a target for increase, and they want to take the local industry to take advantage of all these new technologies which are actually coming. Okay, so that's one. And second is that they are also welcoming back Indians who are actually set up companies in the United States, especially in the Silicon Valley, to come and set up companies in India, and we're giving them a lot of concessions and tax advantages and so on. And apart from this, the state governments are also competing with each other. Okay, as you know, India is a collection of states. You have the central government, and you have like I come from the southern state of Kerala, which is a very small state, and each state is almost like a separate country because I speak a different language, and my customs and culture and everything is different from my neighbors. So if I have to speak to another Indian, I have to speak in English, or I have to speak in Hindi, which is a national language. So states are also competing with each other, like countries, to attract a lot of IT. So they are also giving various kinds of concessions and so on, which would allow this. So the role of the state is very important. The next is the role of the market, and specifically the role of the NASSCOM. The NASSCOM, as I told you, is an industry association, was set up in 1988. Has been singularly, it's a very interesting kind of industry association because it's been very singularly responsible for raising the image of India, because made in India was considered to be a bad label. If something is made in India, even Indians would keep it aside. Okay, made in India is not good at all. Is considered to be synonymous with bad quality, bad workmanship, and so on. But NASSCOM has worked very hard with foreign customers to show that that's not the case. So the role of and for services, this is very important because customers' perception about your capability is much more important than what is your actual capability. So that perception is very important, and NASSCOM has played a very important role in creating that. And I have the details about how they did it and so on. And the next one is this new generation entrepreneurs, which I talked about, with a completely different corporate governance structure. Because all these companies are Western-like, quoted in the stock exchanges, quoted in the Western Stock Exchange. Many of them are in the NASDAQ, and so they are the disciplining force of the stock exchange is much more on them than other family-held Indian companies, which could do all kinds of things without worrying about the external. So that is another one. The next one is the role of the diaspora. And something like the Irish story, a lot of Indians who have actually gone to the, as you know, if you look at the National Science Foundation data again, you will find that Indians forms the largest number of foreign-born scientists and engineers in the United States. Okay? So you have a very large number of scientists and engineers in the US who were born in India, migrated to the US, primarily through the education route, going abroad, as I said, for higher studies and remaining back there. And many of them have set up important small companies, sometimes large companies in the Silicon Valley. And some of them are in the venture capital industry as well, and so on. And they have played also a very important role, especially in the Bangalore cluster, Bangalore and the Hyderabad cluster. Hyderabad is a very interesting cluster because that is a lot of Hyderabadis were actually in the United States, and so they have. In fact, the US has recently started a consulate in Hyderabad and so on. And then, of course, interaction with the discerning customers, which I already talked about. So I think that is are the factors which actually made India to be a major. Now, how is India maintaining this leadership? Okay. First one is that it has a series of conventional strategies of maintaining this. One is to try and move away from services to products. Okay, because that's one way you can maintain your services, and you can. But you have seen that has not worked that well because the share of software products in total exports is roughly the same. I showed you, but there are certain niche areas, like for instance, banking software. Okay, FlexCube is the name of a software which is very much used in the banking and financial sector. Has come from an Indian company to begin with, and there are a number of other things which you can find that in my paper. Okay, and the next interesting thing is that patenting from India has started on a big scale. Okay, so now software cannot be patented in many countries because, as you know, software chain inventions are incremental in nature. So there is also a welfare argument that you shouldn't allow patents. For instance, the European Patent Office does not allow software and business methods to be patented. Okay, but the US PTO does it. The US Patent and Trademark Office. So the Indian inventors are actually going to the US. So if you take the total number of software patents from India, this was something like 140 in 2008. Okay, but by the time 2012, you have 550. Okay, 550. So with such a short period of about 5 years, the number of US patents emanating from India has actually increased. Okay, but you can see that most of those patents are actually by this red fellow, which is basically multinational companies. But the share of Indian companies are also going up. This is the total number of Indian patents. So you can see that the share of software patents in the total number of Indian patents is also increasing. Okay, and the share of domestic companies in patenting is also increasing, but much of the patenting is actually by multinational companies. Now at this point, you can see how much is, what about how does it compare with Ireland? No, sorry. How does it compare with Ireland? Yeah, here it is. This is the total number of patents in India. So the normal thing that you find if you read consultancy reports like McKinsey, Bain and Company, and so on, is that India is low cost and low quality. You put it in that quadrant. Ireland is high cost and high quality. Okay, this is what you find. But look at the number of patents which Ireland gets for in the US for software. When India is getting 515 patents, Ireland gets 17.
But you must take into account that there is a culture against patenting software in Europe.
Yes. I know.
That is somehow not making comparable the number of patents.
Yeah. But I'm not taking the number of patents in Europe. I'm taking the number of patents.
Yes, but the problem is that if a company is living in a country where patenting software is not allowed,
but
then probably they have a bias in terms of culture with respect to that. So that is, I think that you should take more into, is more interesting the fact that you are growing with respect to the American.
That
is an interesting aspect because you are comparing two countries where patenting is relevant. With respect to Ireland, I think that you have paid too much attention to Ireland. Ireland was really a short time expansion because somehow was very weak. So also with respect to the number of engineers, to the quality of the engineers and so on, it was not so. Most of the development of Ireland was for call centers.
Yes, yes. Yes.
That was low level, low quality, low profile, and so that was not.
But let me. That's a good point. I agree with you. But there is in India also software cannot be patented. The Indian Patent Act does not allow software to be patented. So Indian software companies are also working in a similar culture of negative. So if you actually patent software, it's taken as a negative thing. So
I agree.
so the same kind of
the date that is the datum that is interesting is the relation that we are growing.
Yes,
in
yes,
respect
yes,
to
yeah,
Ireland.
yeah,
Because
yeah.
that is a sort of competition with respect to quality.
yes, that's
With
true.
respect to Ireland, really is not so relevant.
Yes,
We in Europe don't look to Ireland like a very important country with
that's true.
respect to
Okay, I
information services.
yeah, I agree with that. Okay, and so now the next strategy which India has. I'm sorry, I see you. I'm sorry.
Be back.
Yeah, I'm sorry. I just go back because I didn't. Yeah. Okay. Okay. The next one is that there is a lot of domain, like you were asking earlier also, there is expertise. Indian companies seems to be moving into a number of domains, like bioinformatics. For instance, this is extremely interesting because using IT in biology and say building a mathematical model of the liver, for instance, and this can be very useful for drug discovery. Okay. So you have a number of interesting bioinformatics companies which have actually sprung up from India during this period. So you can see that software is leading to the emergence of newer industries. Aerospace. A lot of aerospace activities are now taking place in India, making small components for aircraft and so on. As you know, India is on a big buying spree of aircraft, especially for military and also for civilian use. And you have a offset policy which requires that some of these the parts which are used in the aircraft which is imported from outside will have to be made in India. Okay, and so a lot of design activities, for instance, both Airbus and Boeing, and indeed all the major engine companies. I did a survey of some of them quite recently. Have set up shops in Bangalore, and they are developing software for their companies. So, and Indian companies themselves, for instance, Mahindra's, Tata's, both of them have also got a lot of aerospace domain expertise, and so they are actually moving into that. And then automotive sector. Okay. Now, automotive sector, for instance, the central console of a car, where you have the info entertainment systems kept. You see, a company which develops that central console of the car is also in Bangalore, and it does this service for all multinational clients. And it recently been taken over by Mahindra's, which is one of the leading automotive companies in India and so on. Okay, so that is those are the conventional strategies which the Indian company moving into newer domains, patenting, and also in trying to increase the share of products and so on. So these are the conventional strategies which the firms have been using to maintain their leadership. What about the new strategies? This is most interesting. One is size of deals. Earlier, the software companies were only interested in big deals, very big projects from big customers. Now they are not at all interested in big deals. They can take up large number of smaller deals. So that way of, and for that, what they have done is they have developed their processing systems in such a way that it is possible for them to execute various types of projects very quickly. Okay, so that's a kind of a process innovation they seem to have done, which enables them to take even smaller deals and still have a very good in terms of cost and so on.
So without suffering in terms of marginal profitability of the project. Without suffering in terms of marginal profitability of the
Yes,
project.
yes, exactly. Yes. Okay, so that's one thing. The next one is enlarging their skill sets. Okay, one of the interesting things which has happened recently is that companies abroad, customers abroad, are not that much interested in giving you a narrow software-related contract. They would rather go to they go to a consultancy company, like a general consultants, like strategy consultants, like McKinsey or Bain Company or and so on, and where software will be part of that large consultancy project. Okay, and so unless you have consultancy capabilities, your ability to get those software deals is also very much under doubt. Okay, so Indian software companies most of them don't have that much consultancy capabilities. I mean, general managed strategy consultancy capabilities. So they are now assuming that capabilities by taking over companies which are small consultancy firms abroad. For instance, one of the Indian companies have taken this Axon in Europe, which is an engineering consultancy company. So through that acquisition, you assume that capability. Okay. So in fact, almost all companies have those kind of capabilities. Taking advantage of, taking advantage of newer technologies, okay, is another interesting thing, which is like cloud computing, software as a service, okay. So all these kind of new technologies, also the social networking and so on. So the companies are taking care of all these kind of technologies as well. So that is the end of my story. Okay. So basically, what you find is that companies are trying to improve their capabilities, going up the value chain, becoming much more innovative, and remaining thin, reducing the cost of production, and so on. And there are also some of the things which I didn't put here is that their management style is also becoming very, very unconventional. For instance, in Infosys, which is one of the second largest company, when its market share was affected, and it thought that this market share was affected essentially because the top management was not being very dynamic. The top managers and so on were not. So their strategy, they didn't have a kind of strategy like the original founders. The original founders had already retired and left. And one of the founders was Mr. Narayan Murthy, who is considered to be a big, god figure in the Indian software industry. At one point, he was even being tipped as the president of India. When people are willing to elect him as the president of India because he was considered to be extremely, well-trained, very good person. Now, this company has now decided to recall that man. He was retired and was, doing a whole series of other things. But they decided to sort of get him back into the company to shore up his strategy and improve its capabilities and so on. So what I'm trying to tell you is that these companies are extremely dynamic and they are very, very flexible and so on in terms of moving with the change. So that coupled with a kind of a strong vision which seems to be coming from the government. Now this, I must say that government of India is not known for strategic thinking. We don't seem to be having any kind of strategy for most industries. But in the area of software, at least the thinking big, thinking for the future and so on seems to be working, relatively speaking, much better than other industries. So I think I end the story with a kind of an optimistic picture that India may be able to maintain its leadership for several years to come. But of course, this leadership cannot be maintained forever because we have the story from the other products that I mentioned. That China is fast catching up. You can see that it's already become the sixth or fourth largest software exporting country now, and China is very fast catching up. And China also using a lot of conventional strategies. Like for instance, they have set up huge software development centers in India. Okay, and when the Chinese Prime Minister visited India, he did not go to New Delhi he didn't start his state visit in New Delhi by waving flags and so on, but he went straight to Bangalore and he addressed the engineers of the Chinese software company in Bangalore. Okay, so China is also welcoming Indian companies to operate from the various provinces, giving the various kinds of incentives and so on. So China will be the major competitor to India, and that cannot be wished away, because China's investments in R&D and other things are extremely high. Okay,
Yeah, but
so
their English is horrible.
their English may be horrible, but they are fast catching up. Okay, and you don't require. It's not that the Indians speak very good English. Okay, the Indians also have accents and other kind of problems and so on. So it's basically the technical competence. Your technical competence is what is required, and China is fast catching up. So the Indians have to be again pulling up their socks and going up the value chain. So that is why I think this moving up the value chain is the buzzword. Okay, to go from software to software services. Okay, so now I am open for questions.